Bienvenue aux 70e réunion du Comité permanent des affaires autochtones et du Nord. Nous reconnaissons que notre réunion d'aujourd'hui se déroule sur le territoire non cédé des nations algonquines et Anishinaabe. Notre réunion d'aujourd'hui se déroule sous forme hybride, conformément à l'ordre de la Chambre adopté le jeudi 23 juin 2022. Et les membres seront présents en personne ou avec...
Point of order, Madam.
Oh, point of order, yes, sorry.
The English translation's not coming through.
Est-ce que l'interprétation...
Is the interpreting working now? Can you hear the interpreter now? Very good. Members are here in person or on hybrid through Zoom, and the debates will be published on the website of the House of Commons, and when it's broadcast, will be the person speaking.
I'd like to outline a few rules to follow. You may speak in the official language of your choice. Interpretation services are available for this meeting in French, English, and Inuktitut. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen or of either floor, English, or French. Please select your language now. If interpretation is lost at any point, please inform me immediately, and we will ensure interpretation is properly restored before resuming our proceedings. For members participating in person, proceed as you usually would when the whole committee is meeting in person in a committee room. Before speaking, please wait until I recognize you by name. If you are on the video conference, please click on the microphone icon to unmute yourself. Those in the room, your mic will be controlled as normal by the Proceedings and Verifications Officer. S'il vous plaît, adressez vos interventions.
Please speak through the chair.
Please speak slowly and clearly. When you are not speaking, your mic should be on mute. With regard to the speaking list, the committee clerk and I will do the best we can to maintain consolidated order of speaking for all members, whether they are participating virtually or in person. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 of the motion adopted by the committee on April 19, 2023, the committee is continuing its study of the subject matter of C-45, an act to amend the First Nations Fiscal Management Act. Today, we welcome the Honourable Mark Miller, Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations. Thank you so much for being with us today. Along with officials from the Department of Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs, Philip Bertrand, the Manager, Christopher Duchesne, Director General, Indigenous Institutions and Governance Modernization, Andrea Dixon, Senior Policy Officer, and Karine Tremblay, Senior Policy Analyst. And if I've said any of your names wrong, please feel free to correct me. And we will begin, we also have from the Department of Justice, Mr. Andrew Uchchilaroni, Legal Counsel. Minister, you will have 5 minutes for your opening remarks, and the floor is yours.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Français, on écoute. Hello, bonjour à tous.
Hello, everyone.
Want to acknowledge our presence on the unceded territory of the Algonquin people. As well, I want to thank MP Schmale for the recent motion in the House to move things along. Truly appreciated from the side of the government. Madam Chair, honourable committee members, thank you for inviting me today to provide an overview of Bill C-45, the legislation that would amend the First Nations Fiscal Management Act. The legislation, as you know, seeks to support Indigenous self-determination and economic reconciliation. The FNFMA supports communities to exercise their jurisdiction of their financial management, property taxation, and local revenues, and financing for infrastructure and economic developments. The proposed amendments to the legislation before the Committee for Study were co-developed by the First Nations-led institutions established under the Act, the First Nations Tax Commission, the First Nations Financial Management Board, and First Nations Finance Authority, and in addition, the First Nations Infrastructure Institute Development Board. Depuis son entrée en
Since the Act came into force in 2006, it has contributed significantly to the well-being, economic and community development, and self-determination of almost 350 participating First Nations across the country. As you heard from the chairs of the institutions on Monday, these amendments proposed in Bill C-45 seek to address some of the barriers to economic development in Indigenous communities, with the aim of increasing the supports and tools available to participating communities for fiscal management and infrastructure capacity. The most crucial component of C-45 is the establishment of a new entity, the First Nations Infrastructure Institute, or FNII, that would support interested First Nations and other Indigenous groups, including Inuit and Métis partners, with the tools, capacity, and best practices to assert jurisdiction over their infrastructure and asset management needs. The FNII would support participating Indigenous groups to plan, procure, own, and manage their infrastructure assets on their lands.
On Monday, from Alan Claxton and Jason Callow of the First Nations-led Development Board and Technical Working Group of the First Nations Infrastructure Institute, or the FNII, they've set up pilot projects across Canada that have helped identify different service requirements to inform development of processes, standards, organizational designs for the FNII. It will, for example, support infrastructure services transfer to the new Indigenous organizations like the Atlantic First Nations Water Authority. Another one of those pilot projects is in the Chippewas of Kettle and Stony Point First Nation in Southern Ontario. Through this project, the First Nation is developing a feasibility study, business case, and procurement options for water and wastewater asset. They're also developing a financial model that incorporates First Nations Fiscal Management Act tools that can be used for cost recovery to support water and wastewater treatment projects and infrastructure projects that are so crucial to their economic development and for the well-being of their communities. The work is supporting Kettle and Stony Point's community vision for wealth creation, focusing on the creation of an economy for the community and its members to build housing, education, and recreation spaces. The establishment of FNII and success of Kettle and Stony Point are further supported by other amendments put forward in Bill C-45. The First Nation Tax Commission's mandate would be modernized to better support First Nations with their local revenue systems, to strengthen education and capacity supports, and offer advice to self-governing First Nations and other levels of government. Meanwhile, the First Nations Financial Management Board, which helps First Nations strengthen their local financial management regimes and to borrow money, would see its mandate expanded so that they could offer services and certification standards to new clients such as tribal councils and health or education authorities. The last amendment that I'd like to highlight would enhance data collection to enhance the institution's capacity to support evidence-based planning and decision-making.
Collectively, the amendments proposed in Bill C-45 represent an important opportunity to expand and strengthen the institution's mandates to reduce barriers and enhance access to capital and revenues, while supporting communities as they explore and advance economic development opportunities. And I would add that I really would like, I'm anxious to hear your questions on this.
Miigwech, thank you. Merci.
Thank you very much, Minister. We'll now proceed to our first round, beginning with the Conservatives with Mr. Vidal for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Minister. It is a good day today when we all agreed to move this legislation forward in the House just before we get here today. So that's a good thing, I think. Minister, you and I have spoken on several occasions about different pieces of this legislation over the last 3.5 years. Personally, I think the concept of monetization is a very, very positive step for reconciliation across our country. Mr. Daniels from the FNFA on Monday obviously agreed, and I know you know where I'm coming from here, and what he said is we believe that monetization of government transfers, be it a new source of funding or an existing source of funding, will be a big game changer when it comes to closing the infrastructure gap. He went on a little bit later in our hearing on Monday to say, I'm sure at some point in time monetization will happen. I just don't know when. The concept is sound. It works for every other government that does it. Can you just clarify for the committee if Bill C-45 actually includes government transfers in the context of the other revenues component of that, in the context of what Mr. Daniels is asking for? And secondly, could you answer Mr. Daniels' question as to when this concept of monetization will be available to be utilized by their organization across the country?
Oh, and it's a super important question. I think, you know, you do have communities in Canada that have dedicated revenue streams that they would perhaps want to secure and pledge for a larger contribution of capital in order to build projects around in their communities and perhaps outside their communities. Just to be clear, it's not the ambit of this particular bill to address the borrowing pools that would be available for monetization or other forms of securitization. That said, the policies and tools do exist within the current confines to proceed on that basis. It is just a question of financial dedication of funds and appropriations for the proper borrowing pools to allow communities to use that type of leverage for the development of their own communities. Chris maybe has some complementary information with respect to that. This is work that we need to continue with the stakeholders to move forward. Supportive of it, yes, but we need to have a serious conversation about the boring pools and the access to capital that underpin them. Unless MP Vidal, you have a question that you want to ask as well. Chris, maybe want to complement what I just said.
Sorry, I think I can move on. That's fair. I appreciate your response. In that context, again, I want to follow up a little bit maybe on what Mr. Daniels talked about in the context of this concept. If we can get this concept up and running fully, he put it into the comparison of how many houses we could build, how many, water treatment plants or recreation facilities or right? And I have some examples in Northwest Saskatchewan that you and I have talked about in the context of investments in an Orrington strand board mill where, that equity investment would create, significant dividends for 12 First Nations in Northwest Saskatchewan down the road. If we can get these things going sooner rather than later, so many people in a riding like mine that's 70% Indigenous in Northwest Saskatchewan, create the opportunity, create the jobs, create the economic prosperity that comes with this stuff is the way that we're going to solve many of these infrastructure investments, and we know, or the infrastructure challenges, and we know the gap is great. I know you've talked about it lots of times, so I guess I just implore you and the department to say, hey, we need to move on this, and capital streams are going up, 2% a year or something like that, and inflation is going up. Pick a number at this point, right? We're losing ground on these things. So I just would implore you to say, hey, this is such an important concept that I think can be a very, very big part of the solution. And obviously the folks at, in the First Nations Fiscal Management Act organizations would agree with that.
I think absolutely. I think what you have to understand the premises and the conclusion, and obviously to try and state something that makes sense with respect to monetization. It's not the be-all and end-all, but certainly it is a lever that we're not using or having communities use to the full extent that they could, given the current model. There are some communities that don't have the good fortune of having those revenue streams or sources of capital that they could, or sources of income that they could then lever into larger grants, larger forms of financing. The basic premise of what is being advanced is the current grant model that the federal government puts forward is not enough to close the gap in the period of time that we all aspire to close it within. There are other levers that we also have to examine, whether that's within the infrastructure bank, better access to equity as opposed to simply getting debt, looking at the grant model, looking how it serves communities, especially those that are in the most need. But clearly, and I'll agree with you, a long way to agree with you on that point, but we have to fully understand what that particular stream of money is that people are wishing to pledge against a larger set of a financial commitment. And that is not entirely clear all the time in these discussions, but it is a very important one to have, because not all revenue streams can be subject to what these institutions are looking for.
Really quick question?
15 seconds.
Okay, really quick. Hey, in an interview with Paul Wells back in February, you talked about economic reconciliation as how it can become a catchphrase. Can I just ask you what you meant by that?
Absolutely. That probably will take more time than the time allotted, but I think we've had a nasty habit in government of picking winners and losers in Indigenous communities. And when you talk about economic reconciliation, often it has become an opportunity to ignore the elephant in the room, which often is the government not paying its long overdue debts, that the failure of which has caused socioeconomic gaps, and trying to plug that gap with new financial instruments without addressing the underlying causes of that socioeconomic underdevelopment is I think a warning to us all, because we've all been guilty of it. My only point is you can't walk into the most prosperous community in Canada and say this model needs to apply everywhere else in Canada, and I think that is a warning to all of us when we try to use Indigenous communities to augment our own political positions. That was the long explanation of it.
Thank you, Mr. Vidal. We'll move to Mr. Aldag for 6 minutes.
Well, Minister, welcome. It's great to have you here. This is the first time since I've joined the committee that I've been able to be here with you present. So great to see you, and welcome to the officials, and thank you for also being here today. Because I'm fairly new to this committee, I'd like to start with a bit of a high-level question. It's just to get your thoughts on why this piece of legislation is important to reconciliation in Canada. I think we've heard that the Act itself has been in place since, I believe, 2005. So now we're at 2023, and we're putting forward a number of amendments. And why is it at this point in time that this legislation is needed? If you could give us a sense, and particularly if there are others who are new to the table or watching who may be interested in why this legislation is before the House, it would be great to hear from you on that.
Thank you. And it's an excellent question. And even though it is relatively recent in the arc of legislation that deals with Indigenous communities, it has and still is seen as one that is very progressive, namely in what we aspire to be as a country, which is in a position of equals with Indigenous communities. And one of the first things you see when you talk about that position of equals is the reality of the socioeconomic gaps that put us and have put, in particular, the Government of Canada in a position of power. Any talk about nationhood and nation to nation presumes a relationship of equals, and when that socioeconomic relationship isn't the case, it creates the outcomes that we've seen today. A lot of these pieces of legislation were put forward by very progressive members that were Indigenous and had a vision of how their own communities, in the circumstances of being subject to the Indian Act, could get out of some of the more onerous provisions and heavy provisions of the Indian Act and take control over their assets and over their future of their peoples. And so they were put in place with that spirit in mind, whether it was views on how you would get revenue from your own ability to tax or availability of capital. We know in our history that Indigenous communities have had less access to capital than non-Indigenous communities. So all these instruments were put in place with that in mind. Things have changed quickly in the last 20 years. There have been demands, for example, and I think one of the key pieces is the Infrastructure Institute to really have a center of excellence for how infrastructure is built in communities run by Indigenous peoples, and also some changes to the legislation that is the result of advocacy over that period of time, and very recently in particular, when it comes to the 350 plus communities that are scheduled in it. Not all those communities have availed themselves of every instrument under this suite of legislation, but it really does represent a real consensus among Indigenous communities that have signed on as to what is needed to reform it and really get more access to capital through some of the legislative changes. One of the important ones I would highlight is that we're still working on is to make, we have a set of modern treaties and relationships, and to make sure that they have full access to all the levers that exist under these tools.
Thank you. One of the things I noticed when we had the panel here on Monday, many of the progressive councils or bands that you mentioned who were drivers behind this were from British Columbia, an area that I come from. So I was really, really pleased to see that the British Columbian, the First Nations in British Columbia were really at the forefront of this. We heard from one of the witnesses on Monday about how we need to have instruments that allow the nations to work at the speed of business. That was a theme that came up. And one of the issues, as I understand it, is that the legislation is an important first piece, but there's regulations that will need to follow in order to fully implement the suite of tools that are available here. And so in that spirit of operating at the speed of business, could you give us some maybe reassurance or a sense of what that looks like as far as, once we get the legislation in place, how long will it take to, fully implement the other pieces that will be needed to allow the participating nations to avail themselves of the tools that they have?
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question, and I'll answer it partially, then defer to Chris. We've seen one of the biggest points of advocacy we hear from communities is the inability at times, functional inability to have their bylaws enforced. And in this piece of legislation, there are a suite of bylaws, for example, that will allow communities to really have bylaws that have teeth and therefore access the capital that is needed and have those relationships with the communities that they don't have, or their non-Indigenous partners just take for granted. And that allows folks to move at the speed of business. When it comes to some of the regulations and when they are going to be fully in place, do you want to speak a bit about that, Chris?
Very much. Ms. Chair, and thank you, Minister Miller. The legislation does provide for the provisions for regulations to be created. One of the very interesting and big successes of the legislation is that since it was enacted, there has been more and more interest in joining into the legislation, which then results also in the need to create more regulations specific to those target groups that are expressing interest. Modern treaty holders and self-government communities are the ones who have expressed from the very beginning the most interest in getting in on the Act. Creating those regulations is a long and complicated process. We have made great headway recently on those regulations. There will be more regulations in the future created, and we hope in relatively short order those regulations will be in place. That was precipitated by 2 First Nations in your province, and so the regulations will be very specific. One of the challenges on the regulatory front is that each time they are created, they have to be tailored very much to the situation at hand. And so our colleagues at Justice have done yeoman's work with the province and with First Nations in doing that tailoring to make sure that it's legally sound and implementable. But it is a slow process.
So,
Yes.
thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Aldag. Madame Gill, vous avez la parole pour 6 minutes.
Madam Gill, you have 6 minutes. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Minister, and thank you to the Minister's team. I have a few questions, of course, because we always have many. And the first is about economic reconciliation, which is for all. I asked a question last Monday about the participation of First Nations under the First Nations Fiscal Management Act. But then there's the Métis Nation and the Inuit Nation. They are not covered. And so I was wondering what difficulties that causes and what is the willingness to continue and see how it can be extended for those peoples in the coming months. Well, it's opt-in legislation, so it will be up to them to decide. The background for this legislation is one that reflects the dynamic with First Nations and not with the Inuit and Métis. But the recognition of the Métis at the federal level is very recent, so access to capital is even more recent. They have their own financial institutions. With regard to what they choose to do, of course, if they want to be covered by this, we will welcome them. I don't see any obstacles other than perhaps some challenges when it comes to coordinating the legislation with modern treaties with the Inuit people, and those are obstacles that can be overcome. And then, of course, there are political considerations that come into play, but I don't see any legislative problems as such. Thank you. I also have a question with regard to First Nations. Yes, you said it was opt-in, and there's 341 First Nations that are part of it now, if I am not mistaken. And so I wonder that, so if the results weren't as interesting as they are, perhaps there would be fewer people participating. But I'm wondering whether First Nations that were thinking about participating and couldn't will now be able to participate more fully because of the amendments to the Act. So perhaps this will bring down existing barriers. I would assume that that will be the case because, in fact, they told us what the obstacles was. There are 348, and there are only 67 that actually got access to the capital, the millions of dollars of capital. So really, we can see that the legislation works, but we have to see what happens in the future. Question. So on Monday, I was told that those who were consulted for the amendments were people who were already participants in the Act, but that had not necessarily received funding. And so I'm wondering whether those who are not participants perhaps were not consulted and then they couldn't tell why they were not participants. So really, it's important to ensure that people have access to as many tools as possible. Yes. And aside from the vast number of communities who are in the annex or in the schedule to the Act, it is true that it is up to the communities themselves, and some communities see the Act as a colonial piece of legislation, and they see it as conflicting with self-determination. So yes, we have to continue to try to be as inclusive as possible. And I think that the leaders of the organizations involved will be the first to admit it. But they weren't part of the consultation, but but we heard about it through the back door, if you will. But I am happy, I know that, of course, it's a vast project, but there can be ideological or political reasons for refusing to participate, of course. So very quickly, when it comes to the obstacles, which are the main obstacles that no longer exist with the amendments to the legislation? Because I am talking about the amendments and not the additions, like the Infrastructure Institute. Answer. I think that what has been gained is flexibility. The legislation was quite onerous in terms of the authority given to the federal government and not to the communities. So I think that now it really reflects the current situation with regard to access to capital on the part of communities themselves. So it is more flexible and streamlined. There are more services. The institutions really are a reflection of the consultations that we undertook in recent years to make sure that communities get the best access possible to capital. So this is something that has been awaited for a very long time by communities, and I am thrilled to see that you are speeding up the implementation of this because it has been awaited for a long time. I know that the Senate has to give its go-ahead as well, but I'm thrilled. Thank you, Madam Gill.
Minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to each of you for being present. Minister Miller, thank you for your presence and to provide your presentation on the matter of the legislation of the bill. The legislation of the bill and working with the First Nations organizations, this work was very important. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to Minister Miller for your presence and your colleagues as well. I'm glad to see everyone here. The presentation you just provided is very good to listen to, and the First Nations organizations that you worked with in creating this bill and implementing this bill However, we all know that there needs to be other amendments to this bill. For instance, the Hill Times newspaper wrote an article regarding infrastructure, inadequate infrastructure due to a lack of proper funding in the amount of $349.2 billion. The $349.2 billion envelope, and thinking of the laws or the bills that will be amended, what other infrastructures will be created? How will this envelope of funding help reduce the gap of infrastructures?
Yeah, thank you, MP Lote. And I think it's important to take a step back when we talk about this suite of legislation to say this it is only part of the conversation, for sure. And even the discussions on monetization are ones where certain communities would benefit from it, and others, clearly others might not. The way the government has in the past dealt with infrastructure gaps has been insufficient. And when it is typically through a grant model. And when you're talking about the vast sums of monies that are needed to close that infrastructure gap, the reasoning that you have heard from a number of officials is that that grant model is not sufficient. I don't know that to be the case. I think when you look at the suite of tools that exist for Indigenous communities to get access to capital, we certainly have to have an equal amount, if not more, than what non-Indigenous communities have, particularly given the Government of Canada's direct obligation to close those socioeconomic gaps and our fiduciary duties that exist. We have seen in the last couple budgetary cycle vast amounts of infrastructure monies, and we're going into in the case of your constituencies and the people that you serve, MP Lote, really work that will transform some communities, but there's so much more to do, whether it's redoing the infrastructure in Iqaluit in the water, whether it's getting the housing built that I spoke to the Premier about yesterday. These are all things that if we relied solely on the institutions supported by this legislation, it would never happen. And so you need direct support from the Government of Canada in making sure that that actually gets done. So how does that get done? Consistent investments from the Government in Canada into making sure we are closing those gaps in the way that that the Inuit Nunangat policy tells us to behave, which is in co-development in the spirit of self-determination. And that requires constant cooperation with, in your case, NTI and the Government of Nunavut. And we have good relationships with them, but we know that the money is still needed out there, and that will have to come through grant models. Leveraging the infrastructure bank is one aspect. Opening up some flexibility in terms of the availability of capital is another one. We have taken some small steps in that regard. But I think that given the seriousness and the importance of that gap, we have to have all options on the table. So this will play its part, I think, and a very important part. But I think it is very much only one part of the conversation.
Thank you. We know that First Nations organizations or their local bands in the amount of over 300 groups have wanted to be included in this bill. Can you explain how other First Nations people and their bands would not want to be included into this bill, although it seems to be helpful?
I think there's probably a number of reasons that I won't probably do justice to. I had alluded to it a little when I answered MP Gill's question. There are some communities that don't feel that they should be subject to this type of regulation from the Government of Canada, regardless of the potential benefits that it offers. There are perhaps others that don't feel that it is for them for other reasons, for a variety of reasons. And there are probably others that are still not comfortable or have challenges with capacity in even getting to the table. And I think that is where Indigenous services, Crown Indigenous Relations play very important roles in working with communities, and those are often the stories of the have-nots. And I think I have no particular answer to offer to you, but it is not, as you can see in the number, an exclusive club only for the haves. I think I've had conversations with leadership in these groups where they have engaged with communities that are not part of not part of this or not scheduled, and they're eager to help and get out there. So I think there's a bit, lack of a better word, a convincing job to do for those communities that are hesitant. I don't want to speak on their behalf because I know that the variety of reasons are many, but there is some work to do to gain more acceptance. I think this suite, because the previous legislation was in the context seen as heavy-handed, this will open the door to some more of these conversations. But when you look at, those that are scheduled and then those that have accessed capital from 348 to 77, there is a gap there still to be addressed within the current group of scheduled ones as well. So I wouldn't say that everyone in this group, everything is rosy, because it isn't. But again, I do persist in thinking that this is an extremely important suite of legislation that it's important to get passed and modernized, even though it's only a 20-year-old or so piece of legislation. Thanks.
Yannick, Madame Midlot, and we'll now move to our second round with Mr. Melillo for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Minister, for being here. I think it's great that we're moving this forward, and it's always nice when we can agree at least a little bit in this place. So I appreciate you being here on this. I just want to speak to some of the comments that we heard from witnesses in the last meeting, Minister. It's clear that the Infrastructure Institute, that this idea of monetization and the ideas set out in Bill C-45 have been on your department's radar for quite some time, and if I'm not mistaken, the Institute itself has been a part of the departmental plan since 2020, and I'm just wondering, obviously, again, we're all happy to see this moving forward, but I'm wondering if you can shed some light on what happened since 2020, why it's taken so long for us to get to this point.
I guess a combination of things. Building the case has been an important aspect to this. I know that, and I met, whether it was my capacity as Indigenous Services Minister or the current one, I met with a number of the proponents, and they made their cases convincingly. I think in the context and looking at the priorities that we had over that period, you had I know a lot of you guys would say there's a whole heck of a lot of money going out there during that time, but it was to deal with let's hope a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic. And so it is always an issue of priorities. It was very hard, actually, to get infrastructure builds done with communities shut down. That is just a fact, and it is a tribute to particularly a lot of the communities that lifted their boil water advisories during that period of time, to the efforts that were put in to get stuff done. So yes, priorities. Yes, getting the business case across the line. Yes, prioritizing that as part of the budgets in question. And when it comes to the Infrastructure Institute and just these institutions, there is a general perception that they're West Coast led. And I think
I do have limited time, Minister.
No, it's fine.
I appreciate that.
I did want to give you a suite of answers that was helpful.
And maybe you can get to it in the next question here, but I think you can appreciate where I'm coming from on this, because obviously there's a huge infrastructure gap. We have a lot of work we need to do, and all these delays is definitely a concern for me, as I'm sure it's a concern for you as well. So I would suggest that it does remain a priority for your government to move this forward. It's concerning that it hasn't been, of course, over the last number of years, and it brings to mind a situation of Grassy Narrows First Nation. Minister, I know you're well aware of that. I want to thank Ms. Idloot for raising this concern as well in the chamber earlier today. because it should be nonpartisan. I mean, this community has been struggling with the effects of mercury poisoning for decades, Minister, as you know that. And I recall working with yourself and with Chief Turtle shortly after I was elected, almost 3 years ago, when an agreement was reached, and we were all excited to see some progress happen there. And now, unfortunately, we're seeing further and further delays. Can you speak to why we're seeing delays with this project, and can you tell us when your government will keep its promise and deliver this treatment center?
I think when we talk about the agreement with Grassy Narrows, that was really important to sign and to commit to building a mercury treatment facility, and not just the mercury treatment facility, but a new water plant. There was over $80-some million put on the table for operations of the facility and building of the facility, without counting the new water plant. And that's a lot of money. It took a pretty innovative approach with the community at the time to get that across the finish line. What we've seen clearly, without speaking to the discussions that are ongoing, because those are discussions that are being led by Minister Hajdu, is there has been an increase in the cost of building materials. The process that was put in place
in
is
part
one
because of the delays, of course. I just want to make that clear. Of course, each year there's a delay. We will see construction costs increase. Which is why it's so important that we move forward on this quickly.
Yeah, I mean, look, there was a 12 to 18-month window once the agreement was signed, whereby there were feasibility studies to be done and a full costing of this to be done. I think we're at a point now where we've seen cost increases, and that really is something that I'll defer to Minister Hajdu's good leadership to get across the finish line. I think the point to take away from this is we're committing to making sure that folks at Grassy Narrows get the justice that they deserve.
9 seconds, so thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Malila. We'll move to Mr. Batiste for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Minister, for being here today. On Monday, we heard from several of the leaders about how important optionality was for this bill, and how, when we're moving forward with First Nations, a lot of the time government has had a we know best attitude in many decades past that has harmed the trust between First Nations and the federal government. And they spoke to why optionality is a very important part of this piece of legislation and the work that they're doing. I'm wondering first if you could speak to why optionality and opting in for band council is an important part of the advancing reconciliation. And the other part is how does this help us implement some of the principles surrounding UNDRIP in terms of what we've promised in C-15, and what does this mean in the relation to what are trying to accomplish with UNDRIP and moving forward with this legislation?
I think, MP Batiste, you said it best when you said that it is really up to communities to choose. The Indian Act is not only a racist document, it is one that's been imposed on communities. Getting out from under it has been the subject of a lot of simplistic thoughts as to how that happens. But when you sit down, it is a complex web of insidious discrimination that has affected pretty much every facet of Indigenous identity and experience, especially in the on-reserve scenario, for anyone that knows the history of the Indian Act. And so this legislation allows or gives the optionality to communities to say yes, but importantly to say no. And whatever reason that is, we often in government just need to accept why that is. That we mentioned that I mentioned earlier that going from 348 members or people that are scheduled on, or communities that are scheduled on in the annex, to 77 that have drawn down on or exceeded the financing under this particular regime is important, but it isn't necessarily linear for people. Some people don't want the on-reserve property taxation law. There's only 133 that are have developed and implemented those laws as part of the Tax Commission. There are 256 that have enacted financial administration laws and 210 that have received certification. Is this a natural progression? It may or may not be. Some of it is important, and some of it is take it or leave it for some communities. And so, as part of developing the amendments and the package that you have in front of you today, that has been something that has been stressed time and time again. And as progressive as it was perceived 20 years ago, that currently isn't the case today, and it leaves partners not able to move at the speed of business, as they said quite clearly on Monday, for example. And so that is key. I think it's a matter of financial speed as much as it is the ability of people to affirm their right to determine what they do with themselves and their own community. And in that sense, it is in the spirit of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and frankly responds to some of the TRC calls.
So I just want to make clear that, when we're looking at all of the First Nations communities across Canada, many bands, that nothing in this legislation changes anything in those communities unless they choose to be a part of it. Is that correct? Okay. With my final 30 seconds I think I have, I just want to be able to thank all the members of this committee. We heard from Manny Jules about the lessons he learned from his father about meeting at the speed of business, and I saw that as a committee we did our best for within 48 hours to get to make sure that we weren't moving at the speed of government and moving at the speed of business. So I feel like I just want to thank my colleagues from the various parties who are here today, as well as the Green, who've gave us unanimous consent to move fast on this, and hopefully we get it through and continue to move at the speed of business for all the First Nations in Canada that want to be a part of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Batiste. We have Madame Gill pour 2 minutes et demi.
Mrs. Gill for 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm sorry, you'll have to call them to order. I'll continue asking about obstacles. The minister was saying earlier that certain First Nations see the Act as a colonial measure. So if they don't come back through consultation, it will be difficult to change the Act so that it is no longer seen as being colonialist. So I wonder, do you see barriers that can be taken out of the Act, and particularly with regard to the perception that the legislation is colonialist? Answer. So I think that what is immediately obvious is that, well, this is legislation being enacted by a government in Parliament to bring back measures that were removed from Indigenous peoples because of our colonial history in this country are provided to them. And in that context, it's very difficult to avoid the colonialist argument. No, I didn't want to put you on this spot like that, but yes. So when we look at the legislative system here in Parliament in Ottawa, what we have to remember is that this was co-developed and that communities were consulted so that they could use their right to self-determination. It's an opt-in legislation, so it's up to them to decide whether they want to be a part of it or not. It's not up to the Canadian government to decide that. And so it has to do with trust. And we know that there is sometimes very little trust on the part of Indigenous communities toward the government. And so when we can have trust, we have to build it. And that means dialogue. The bill and the amendments to the Act that you've seen in the documents before you show that, or express that spirit of co-development to build trust and also to give Indigenous communities access to capital and remove obstacles. In 1 second, perhaps, do you think that the bill in its future form, once it is adopted and once the amendments to the Act are adopted, that they will really go as far as it can when it comes to its purpose? Answer, we'll see what the Senate says, but I do think so. I think that, yes, there's always more work to do. There was mention of monetization and other challenges. But I think that this really was co-developed with our partners from A to Z, and I am very proud of that. Thank you, Mrs. Gill.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Bill C-45 the implementation process took a long time, and the partners you worked on this bill, on this legislation with, the First Nations bands, as you were working with them, through the work that you did with them, this legislation was created. I would like to ask, you say that your government is important. You say that you need to work in partnership with First Nations, Métis and Inuit. You have to work in partnership with all the Indigenous groups. Why is this bill only being implemented at this time when you say that this bill is very important? Why, can you answer me, why have we been waiting for this legislation for so long?
Economic for that. I think we can always go faster. I think in this case, it has been relatively quick. I would say, with the exception of the Infrastructure Institute, I think that it took some time for us to come around to, and especially to secure. You can create these entities, but if you don't secure the funding for it, their ability to really engage and be at the height of the expectations, particularly, and I want to thank the advocacy of Manny Jules for that, because it has been something that has been really it's the brainchild of his. It did take some time, and I think it did take his advocacy and advocacy of many others to convince the federal government this was the right thing to do. I think sometimes the governments have a control problem, and we don't like letting go. And that requires trust, and that requires partnership. And so having an infrastructure institute that would not necessarily be dependent on the federal government, or at least could provide advice and that confidence that Indigenous communities require in order to get things built is an element to that. So I think this is an important day for people that have fought so hard for that, but sometimes governments take a little time to learn how to let go.
Thank you, Ms. Sidlow. Mr. Zimmer for 5 minutes.
Did you want to take it, Jamie? I could start. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, Mr. Schmale will be taking that.
Sure. Mr. Schmale, please proceed.
Well, thank you, Mr. Zimmer. So kind. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. And I just want to echo your words, Minister, that you said at the beginning. Great work by every member here to move this piece of legislation through, to Mr. Batiste, to Madame Gill and Ms. Idlout for that great work. And, of course, the team here. So my question kind of goes to the process now. We're expected to do clause by clause, I believe, on Monday, so we'll wrap this up. Do we do we see a sense on the government side that we'll have this on the agenda in the House to debate as soon as possible before we rise in June?
So I guess two things. I've got a list of things that we'd like you guys to pass by unanimous consent if you so choose. But I won't throw this is your question, not mine. I really hope so. I mean, this is something we have to work with the government leader, with the government leadership team to make sure it's prioritized. I think all partners want to see it, and we want to get it to the Senate as quickly as possible. We know the Senate has stated quite deliberately that it wants to, that particularly when it comes to Indigenous matters, wants to take the time to review it, given the level of advocacy that we see there. But I'm jumping ahead of things, and that's a conversation that we'll absolutely have with House Leader and push to prioritize.
But you can see my concern, right? Like, it wasn't even on the calendar to debate for second, right? To send it to committee. And although it was a great sign of a unified front here, it wasn't even in the calendar in the near future. I just don't want to see 45 disappear into the abyss when it is a priority for everybody. And while unanimous consent is a tool that can be used from time to time, I don't think it should be the tool that's used all the time. It deserves debate in the committee room. It deserves debate in the chamber. So I think I'd like to see, if possible, I know you're not controlling the House agenda, but I would like to see it given a bit of priority on the government side to get it on the table, get it in front of the House for debate so we can push it to the Senate as quickly as possible.
I guess in terms of agreeing with you, but in terms of being able to get it done, we'll need to work with our team of House Leader. But I think we've had some pretty good partnership on all party sides to get this done. And so if that priority is articulated clearly to the House leaders, I have a lot of hope for this, because there isn't a person who doesn't want to see this done.
If you want suggestions on what legislation we can take off the calendar, I'm sure we have a whole bunch we could throw in front of you if you need that help.
We're aware of your ability and desire on those fronts.
Did you have any questions? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, well, I'm going to be a little bit, I guess, more blunt. And I know Mr. Schmale is trying to be nice. But I guess I question the motives of this government. You've had the opportunity to do this for the last 8 years. And it took an opposition UC motion to get it advanced. And so there's one problem with that alone, but there's another problem with the future of this bill. And so what is the future of the bill is kind of what my colleague, Mr. Schmale, has asked. But it doesn't give me or us much confidence, or First Nations, frankly, for that matter, that it will advance, right? There's a lot of talk, but little action. A lot of hot air, but little in terms of delivery. I guess I would like to see some assurance from the Prime Minister and from you, Minister. It sure seems like you have the will to push this forward, but you had the will before the UC motion too, and it wasn't advancing. So where does it leave us now?
So let's not pretend for a second that the UC motion magically created a priority for this bill. That would be disingenuous for anyone to pretend that. We'd appreciate it and absolutely would encourage it at the next stage as well. There are so many advocates that have fought to get this done, and this is important for them to see. So for any of us to pretend that we're the champions of this would be disingenuous. But this has been, as a minister in this role, this has been one of my top priorities. And I've had a team that has pushed this through at every stage as quickly as it can go. I wouldn't say it's been 8 years coming, but it's certainly been a couple when it comes to certain parts of this. And I know you have the consultation record to underpin that. So I am, to the extent I have the power to move things, you have my commitment that we'll be moving this forward as quickly as we can, and getting this across the line. And really do appreciate your advocacy in that respect, because it is very welcome. And in all openness, there are a couple other bills that we'll need your support on that sometimes I feel really shouldn't be in front of parliamentarians because it's really about communities deciding what they want to do themselves. So I do appreciate it, is what I'd like to conclude on.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Zimmer and Mr. Schmale. We'll now move to Mr. Weiler for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd also like to thank Mr. Smale for tabling that motion, the unanimous consent motion which passed, and it's actually not the first time we've been able to do that in this committee. We were able to pass the modernization of a number of self-governing agreements through unanimous consent last summer, and Minister, to your point, that was probably legislation that never needed to come to this House for how communities want to be able to govern themselves here. But Minister, I appreciate you being here today. And I just want to have a few questions about the Act itself. It's really exciting that there's now almost 350 communities that have signed on to these various measures. But really, perhaps the First Nations that are most in need of the institutions and the powers that they can provide are not signed on yet. And these are also communities that can most benefit from things like access to better infrastructure, where particularly in remote areas where they also have troubles with the granting process and being able to go through all that and access money that we do set aside. So I was hoping you can maybe speak a little bit to how these amendments will make it easier for smaller communities to be able to sign on and get that better financial management system in place to be able to access some of the benefits that come along with it.
I clearly, and this is something I'd spoken about briefly earlier about what this legislation is and what it isn't and what it represents for communities. It isn't a tale of have and have-nots. It has been instrumental in making sure that those have-nots are now haves. And I'm wildly overcharacterizing and simplifying the dynamic that exists. It is the case, and I'll repeat that because it is the case, that in this country there are still communities that are in desperate need of support from the federal government, usually because of some actions taken by the federal government in the past. Notably, as I'd raised earlier, not paying our bills with respect to treaty, not causing immeasurable damage in the first place, and now being in a position where we have to compensate. The bill is premised on a number of things, particularly with the reforms, the capacity of communities to determine themselves what they need to do, and that is some of the refinement that we see in the number of the pieces of legislation that you have in front of you. But it's also a reflection of the need to expand, as you'd mentioned, to communities that are perhaps hesitating. Often this legislation and the institutions that underpin it has been mischaracterized as municipalizing Indigenous communities or forcing them to tax their own. The optionality of, I think, clears a lot of the air with respect to what communities would choose or choose not to do. There have been efforts, and there continue to be efforts by the organization, by its leadership, to engage with communities, and for example, now to try to pitch communities on what expertise they can bring to the table when it comes to some of the critical infrastructure that those communities have and are not optimizing, even based on the grants that have been supported by the Government of Canada. And so I think sort of making it easier to access, making the institutions less Ottawa heavy, but also giving them more funding and the capacity to engage with communities that wouldn't say on the outside looking in, but are looking to do things in a different way in their communities. And it's hard to pinpoint line item measures, but in and of themselves, with the totality of the package in front of people, I think this will be a lot more attractive, particularly with the crucial addition of the Infrastructure Institute, which really is something that'll be, it could be game-changing for a number of communities in need.
Thank you. And maybe just to follow up on that last point, there's going to be an important component of the First Nations Infrastructure Institute on kind of knowledge and experience sharing. And I was hoping you might be able to speak a little bit about that and how the nations may be able to learn from what has worked and what hasn't in different parts of the country.
And I'd say we're learning as well. I mean, Minister Hajdu is championing a number of elements in and around infrastructure reform. and how the Infrastructure Institute fits into that will be key. They can both complement each other, but I think with the suite of experience that Manny Jules brings to the table, with the folks that know how to build best for their own communities, what's worked, what hasn't worked, and what are some, there is predation that occurs when it comes to infrastructure builds, particularly when people see dollar signs flying across the table in amounts they perhaps not seen in generations, often coming from outsiders, and having that guidance from people that have been through that experience and navigated it, or even been able to leverage their own ideas and even push the federal government to do things in a different way, is something that I think is invaluable. And there are not people in the government of Canada that can replace the Indigenous knowledge and the experience and the trust that an institute like that brings to the table. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Weiler. That concludes our second round. Mr. Schmale?
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair. I will, as Mr. Zimmer said, I'll continue my nice streak here. Thank you, Minister, for staying late and finishing off that round. That was very kind of you, and I appreciate the question and answers. Let's try 2 for 2 for UCs today. Since the answers were good, we're great on this legislation. Motion to adjourn.
Seeing agreement, I'd like to thank Minister Miller for appearing today. I'd like to thank and his officials, of course. We really appreciate your time. I would also like to announce that Friday at noon, we will need to, all of our amendments by Friday at noon, and then clause by clause, we will begin on Monday. So thank you very much for doing this important work.